With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Looks like a Heard Tell show. Okay, let's talk some economy. That means we got to bring in one of these economist people. And this is the one we have on quite a bit. Our buddy Jericho Hill has returned. He works for one of those 4-letter, not 3-letter government organizations. That's because all the other 4-letter words were taken, so they go to acronyms. Jericho Hill, how are you, my friend?
Just recovering from a cold and feeling pretty good now.
I see you got the killer bees on your shirt there. That would be great if our government actually did budgets, but
it would be, but we haven't done budgets for several decades now, and we probably won't do budgets for several decades. It's more about your personal budget is what I'm advocating.
You need to update that for the current parlance and back that budget up. Maybe would be a good shirt.
So, that might be a retro shirt, but okay.
All right. We've got, once again, we have what looks on the surface to be conflicting economic information. We're in this really weird thing where we have a growing economy coming out of the pandemic, but all the indicators that we usually use say things are awful, but at the same time, things aren't really awful to people other than gas prices and inflation and things like this. The GDP number did the same thing. Everybody thinks it's terrible and everybody thinks it's no big deal. Is it one, the other, or somewhere in the middle?
So look, you have two hands as an economist, so there's always on one hand and on the other. So let me demystify this GDP. So first off, what happened? GDP shrank by 1.4% at an annualized rate. Now again, that's taking the quarter's growth or not growth and putting that out for a whole calendar year, right? And expectations were that it was going to be, it was going to grow at a slow rate. So the fact that it was negative, right, it was kind of a big miss. And so everyone's trying to figure out what exactly happened here. So look, it's a bad number, right? The slowing economy. The first thing that I want to say about this though is if you're a non-economist, one fact I want you to have is quarter one of any year is historically the lowest growth quarter. That is without fail. I can go back 3 decades and it's just a pattern that holds up. So even, there's probably, reasons why quarter one is always weaker compared to say quarter four typically, right? Part of that might be because of companies in normal years buying up inventory in quarter four for the Christmas shopping season and them not buying inventory in quarter one because they have a bunch of crap they got to get rid of. Okay, so we actually see this in the data. We see that inventory was not filled up like it had been. In fact, inventory contributed to almost a full percentage point. So you could back it out and basically GDP growth would have been about a negative 0.5 instead of negative 1.4 annualized if we didn't have this inventory thing. So that's the first thing that I want to get out of the way is quarter one's pretty much always bad for the year. It's almost always driven by inventory. And here again, it's driven by inventory. So that's one thing that I want to say. The second thing, that we see is one of the misses was people's consumption. We expected it to grow by 3.5%. It rose by 2.7%. So I think we can sort of now say, look, I told you that if we actually had the inventory thing sorted out, we'd be at negative 0.5. And then if consumption rose the way we thought it was going to, we would have been positive 0.2 or 0.3%. It was still a bad number, right? This is still bad. But we can sort of get to figuring that out. One thing I want to say is there's a lot of articles that go into how like net exports contributed to this. This is an accounting identity in econ. And so if you're blaming the bad GDP number on exports or net exports or imports, you don't understand basic math. So just ignore all takes that deal with that. So that's sort of like what's happened now. one of the things I think I've been consistent in criticizing the Biden administration about is not being explicit about the trade-off that they and their partners in Congress made when all these sort of COVID relief plans were enacted. The choice set that should have been clearly articulated to the American public that was not was, we're going to protect jobs and we're going to get unemployment down fast so that people go back to work, because we know that if people stay out of work a very long time, it is very, very bad, not just for the individual workers, but for families. People lose skills, the economy suffers, and the growth of the nation suffers in the long term. That is a bad outcome. So we're going to make the choice to put policies in place that are get people back to work far sooner than expected. And in fact, if you look at what economists were expecting for when employment would get back to sort of quote normal levels before COVID, we were expecting 2024. We're already blown past that in the first quarter of 2021, where we're actually down to 3.5% unemployment with our preferred method of calculating it. So that's great. That's a fantastic policy win. The cost was that prices would run hot. And I was, like many economists, expecting the price running hot to last for just a very short while. We were wrong about that. I was wrong about that. You need to own your mistakes. Prices are going to run hot for a little bit longer. We are seeing positive signs that we hit the peak of the price increases in the last 2 or 3 months. We're seeing a lot more signs that we're going to start to see deceleration of price growth going into this year. Probably not enough to help the Dems. But we were wrong about that. But like, that's the choice set. So people are being hurt by high gas prices. People are being hurt by housing costs rising so high, unless you already own your house, which 2/3 of Americans do. So you're on a fixed rate mortgage, so it doesn't really matter, unless your property taxes went up like crazy. But that's another story for another day. So that's sort of the basic nutshell that I think I would say is, look, Q1 was bad. I expect it to be bad. It's not as bad as it looks, but it's still bad. We made the trade-off, right, to basically to get unemployment back. We're going to have high inflation. Now we're entering the danger zone. And this is where I'll let Andrew come back with something, because the danger zone is, we're driving a car, we're behind a tractor trailer that's braking, and we have an idiot on the cell phone on the car behind us. How quickly do we tap our brakes? Because we don't want to hit the truck. This is what the Fed's trying to do. We don't want to hit the truck because that's bad. We also don't want to have the idiot on the cell phone hit us from behind. So the Fed's trying to slow down the price growth, pull the economy back a little bit without losing the employment gains that we've had. And this is a very delicate tightrope that's going to sort of be a dance for the next couple of months. Historically speaking, the Fed's kind of struggled at this.
Yeah, and the thing we really don't want to do is get rear-ended up underneath the truck and get the worst of both. Let me ask you this.
Exactly.
Since we're talking prices, let's talk supply side for just a second. I was sitting behind a train yesterday. I was watching all those containers go by, the double stacked on the train. We talked a lot about supply side stuff. We talked about a supply side inflationary curve back during the pandemic. We're moved on from that a little bit. What's the data saying about that? Is that lingering into what's going on now, or did it wash out and now we're dealing with more of the oncoming traffic, as you said, as opposed to the rear ending part?
So we still have supply chain issues that are still driving up some of these challenges. We can still see that the price of lumber is exceedingly elevated. And we know the price of some stuff coming from Asia is still elevated, and we still have backlogs. So, the data that we're seeing is showing that those effects are mediating. They're getting less bad over time, but they're not coming down as fast as we would hope. And this is part of the problem, and as we would want. And part of it is because this isn't, COVID was an international event. And as much as we want to criticize the US policy response under both Trump and Biden, and sort of also the response of the American public, compared to a lot of other countries in the world, particularly in Asia, some of the Asian countries did great, but some of the Asian countries where we get a lot of our imports from, not so great. Take up of vaccines is not as good as what we have here. So it's getting better. It's getting better. It's getting better, but it's getting better slower than we would expect. Much like the cold that I had took a lot longer than I wanted for me to get over it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a fence quoted for my backyard, and they won't even quote you wood fencing right now. They said nobody can afford it anyway, and it would take us too long to get it, so we don't even bother quoting it right now. That's how bad the wood is.
I'm trying to build an addition, an ADU, accessory dwelling unit, on my property, and we're having the architect draw up the plans now. I'm not anticipating starting construction on that until maybe mid next year.
Wow. Yeah, it's a mess. Talking to Jericho Hill, our economist friend. Let's talk about one other item you mentioned in there and kind of skirted by it for just a second, though. Inflation and prices. Everybody thinks they're necessarily coupled together, but that's not exactly the truth. They're not exactly dead set together. Talk about the relationship there with the prices a consumer sees on the shelves and inflation, because there is some lag there. There's some waves to those sorts of things. Talk about that, because everybody just assumes, well, inflation and prices, they're linked together. They go up and they go up. That's not exactly, it's a little more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think the nuance is it depends on what type of U.S. household you are. If you're a household that owns your home on a fixed rate mortgage, property price increase, property price appreciation, inflation, rent inflation doesn't really affect you, right? And that's a huge part of your budget. Now, if you're a renter or you're someone trying to buy and you have to buy because maybe you have to move to a city because you got a job there, right? That's going to weigh pretty heavily on you. That's going to be a pretty big impact on your budget. If you're, again, like we saw this for a long time, we talked about the used car market. If you were someone who couldn't afford a new car and you need to buy a used car, you were paying a lot of money for that. If you're someone whose household consumes lots of energy, maybe you have a lot of little rugrats running around, you're subject to a lot more inflation than, say, a childless couple, or a single person living at home, or just a couple with one kid. So these price changes affect people differently. It also depends on where you shop. Like, certain retailers are going to see higher price increases than others because of how they source their supply chains. So if you shop at Costco, maybe it's when you're in that demographic, you're not so affected. And I think that's sort of where we might lose track as policymakers up here in DC, is we're in a particular kind of bubble. Most of us are homeowners. Most of us do buy from Costco. Most of us are fairly insulated from a lot of the costs that a lot of Americans outside of these big cities are dealing with. And we have to sort of keep that in mind. And I understand, why there's some angst there and why there's desire to bring that back down. Again, the trade-off was, did you want to be working, right, and have a job and not be out of work, or do we want to face these high prices? I would take the higher prices as a choice every day over leaving people long-term unemployed. And just, I think that destroys families far more than, what I hope is, maybe another year of dealing with price changes that are coming down but still elevated, and maybe we get back to normal next year, right?
Yeah.
If that's the choice that I'm happy with the temporary pain there.
Yeah, Jericho Hill, our economist friend, breaking this down so even I can understand it. We're going to take a quick break. We come back on Hartel. We'll get into more of this economic stuff. We'll get into the politics of it. It is an election year. I'm going to ask him a little bit of rapid fire, see what an economist thinks about some of the campaign lingo that we're going to be hearing over the next couple months. Jericho Hill on Hartel right after. Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. That's Jericho Hill, our economist buddy, in the fancy dancy graphic print T-shirt, because that's what all the economists are wearing these days.
Let me bust out my tariff shirt sometime. That we got Senator Orrin Hatch to wear. Scott Lennencom would love it. Yeah,
the late Senator Orrin Hatch, God bless him. Mm-hmm. Great Twitter follow, by the way. I don't think his replacement will be nearly as fun.
No.
Let's talk economy for just a second. This is an election year, so I want to ask you a couple things. Since you're the economist and I'm not, I'm going to throw you some of the buzzwords we're going to hear, because let's be honest, this is the 8th or 9th most important election of my lifetime, to be followed by the 10th most important election of the lifetime next week. We hear the exact same.
I agree with you on that. I am with you 100%.
Yeah, we hear the same economic terminology every election. So I'm just going to ask you how they land with you when you hear them on a campaign ad You're there in Northern Virginia, so I'm sure your airwaves are all campaign commercials right now. It's pretty brutal where I'm at. So let's hit a couple of these real quick.
But just be glad you're not in Georgia.
Our friend Jason Downey just had him on the program talking about it, and he said, there is nothing but campaign ads right now. I was just talking to a radio buddy. He was like, yeah, I hate it. He's like, all my commercials on the radio station, but it's paying the bills. We paid the whole quarter off in one ad buy. Thank you, Club for Growth. Anyway, let's hit some of these items. Okay, when you hear a campaign talk about lower taxes, how does that hit your economic ears? Because a congressman, a senator, even a governor, they don't really have a whole lot of say over tax policy, but each and every one of them always campaign on tax policy. How does it hit your economic ears when you hear that on a commercial?
They can campaign on what their state and local locality can control, which is typically sales tax or property tax, right? Some states have income taxes, but not very many. I would say we're dealing with inflation right now, so sort of the last thing we need to really do is to do a tax decrease, which will put more money back into the economy at a time we're trying to take money out of the economy and slow price growth. I get it. I get wanting to have lower taxes for folks, especially folks that might be hurting, but right, that could backfire. That could send inflation up. But then again, maybe these governors don't care about that because the inflation is Biden's problem. It's not the governor's problem.
Yeah. Speaking of inflation, every election I've ever had, it is Reaganomics, the Clinton economy, the Bush economy, the Bush recession, the Obama recession. You see where I'm going with this. It's always like this, the Trump tax
Biden
cuts,
inflation.
Whatever. So now we're going to deal with the Biden economy, the Biden inflation. When you hear that terminology, because we hear it every election year, whoever's in the chair, they get blamed for the economy. How does that hit your economic ears?
A lot of what we're dealing with were things outside of our control in the country because we were dealing with a worldwide pandemic. So it's somewhat unfair to pin it all on Biden's policies, but it's also fair to pin a bit of it on him. And I think especially hey, they wanted to get a lot of money into the economy to basically make sure the unemployment got back to low levels that folks that we had, and that's the consequence. And so they made policy choices that created the inflation too, that helped bring it along. So they deserve part of the blame on this. Not all of it, but part of it. But hey, that's the breaks of being the guy in charge.
Another one that's the breaks of the guy in charge because it is a lagging indicator, no matter what anybody else tells you about gas prices. Now, obviously, there's a caveat to this one because the president campaigned on reducing fossil fuels. That means they reduce output, they reduce planning. So that some of that is on him. But there was the war on Ukraine. That's going to crank things up. When you hear about gas prices and we're going to fix the gas prices and the Biden did that stickers on all the gas pumps I keep seeing all over the place, how does that hit your economic ears?
I mean, look, this is sort of the two-faced nature of politics, right? You said Biden, was, campaigning for cleaner energy. He was to sort of reduce our reliance on gas-powered cars and whatnot and bring in more electrified vehicles. That clearly was a policy choice. That would imply that we'd have less capacity for gas, and that would be an upward pressure on prices. And then, they also want to release a bunch of oil barrels from a strategic reserve to lessen that. It sort of goes against the policy choice. Again, maybe it's bad politics, but when you and I talk, I just feel like owning what your goal is and stating clearly what the trade-offs are that you're going to get to the goal. So, hey, we want cleaner vehicles, we want a cleaner environment, we want to reduce our reliance on gas, we want to reduce our reliance on Russian energy. Good goals. Guess what? There are consequences to that. Yeah. Maybe 2/3 world phenomenon, 1/3 Biden's to blame. He's got to own some of it.
Yeah.
I just wish that we could be more honest about this.
Yeah. Here's one that we need to be more honest about that we talk about every single time. I'm going to bring back manufacturing jobs. Now, I always would love for one enterprising reporter to ask them when they're going to bring back tooling and ball bearings, because you're not having any manufacturing in the country until we bring those two things back. And we don't do those in America anymore because you got to have that to have the bigger manufacturing. But when you hear manufacturing, that's a big thing in economics because of the indicators for it. It's something that America has declined in doing, and we import it more than we export it. How do you hear we're going to bring back those manufacturing jobs?
I mean, look, the developed world has moved those jobs to the developing world. That was a choice that made by pretty much every country. The leading edge industries are not manufacturing and will not be. Those are not manufacturers, not the driver of growth anymore. It used to be, but the world and the economy changed. I would hope that our policymakers, we want to keep the US focused on delivering those drivers of economic growth to produce jobs, both high skill and low skill down the line, in these emerging technologies, in these emerging, industries. That would be good policy. So like I get for the industrial workers in say West Virginia, right? You have, coal's not coming back. Like, auto manufacturing to like what it was in the 80s is not coming back. And politicians should just simply be honest about that. And we should work to sort of think about how do we shift our job training? How do we shift our educational system to produce workers that'll thrive in that new economy? And thinking 10, 20 years down the road. Look, 20 years ago, I was working. I mean, you had your guests from the Board of Education. I was a student member of the Board of Regents of the state of Georgia. I was pushing for policies that would increase funding for our community colleges and small local colleges in Georgia, because their infrastructure, what they had available in the classrooms for students to learn was just paltry. And that's where a lot of our, sort of skilled jobs, not necessarily college educated, but skilled trade jobs, and whatnot, where folks would go to get their associate's degree or their training or their tradesmanship, and we weren't funding that, and we should. So yeah, let's think about what the world's going to look like in 10, 20 years, what these emerging technologies are, and figure out how to get those companies here, how to create them. Let's do what we should do. Let's waive the visa requirements for all the smart people from Russia to get them to leave that country and come over here to the land of opportunity. Let's open up that can to everybody. And let's just bring the bright people over here. Let's bring the energetic and industrial people over and have them start companies, right? Immigrants start companies at rates far higher here in the US than native born folks do. And those are the folks that we want to have, because they're going to create the jobs of the future.
Yeah, it's another topic for another day, something we're working on for a future episode. But that labor gap, it's almost identical to the drop in immigration over the last 2 years. Isn't it funny how that works out? Anyway, we'll talk about that in a future episode.
1 billion Americans, it unites both left pundits and right pundits.
Yeah, let's open that can of worms another day, shall we? All right, here a couple more of these real quick though, because it is campaign season. We hear the same things over and over and over again. Housing is starting to creep into campaign ads. I've actually seen some affordable housing ads. You never used to see those. I'm for it, but the problem here is who makes it affordable, because we all know when the government goes to make something affordable, it usually doesn't really end up being affordable. Let's talk a minute. It's something I know you spend a lot of time thinking and digging into, but I've actually seen a couple campaign ads. They ran one in West Virginia about they did a block grant for the whole state to get rid of blighted houses all at once, because it makes it a lot cheaper to do, because you pay for 100 houses instead of 10. Smart policy, I think. So credit to them. But I'm actually seeing some housing policies show up in campaign ads. You wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago. How does that hit your economic years?
I mean, housing is the single biggest budget item in most families' budget. We should focus on that if we want families to be better off. So yes, I do a lot of work locally on trying to help expand housing supply. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. Here what we do is we like giving homeowners, property owners options. I live in an area where you can build a single family house. You can also build a duplex if you want, or a triplex. You can build a tiny home out back. We call that an ADU, or accessory dwelling unit. You could turn your basement into a grandma, suite, live in an apartment and rent that out. And those are options right there that I'm saying. Those are options that local governments can enact. They just require a zoning change, possibly, or just a little local policy change. But the local government doesn't expend any money to do it, and local governments are cash strapped. Other things that I've seen local governments do is they've said, look, we're not going to tell you how to build this new apartment complex, right? But if you want to have a 6-story complex rather than a 4-story complex, we'd like for you to put X number of units and designate them affordable based on our affordability guidelines. And then we'll give you the variance to build up higher. Local governments can't really fund this. right? They have to just basically provide the incentives for folks to do it on their own. And so I agree with Andrew. Like, we've had experience of, like, look, we built Section 8 housing a long time ago in this country, right? And we concentrated low income families into the same area. And that had consequences that were not good for those low income families. And now we're seeing a lot more mixed use planning and development, mixed income development, which based on the research, has better financial outcomes for those lower income persons, better financial stability, better household stability. So, things that we can do for that, but it's not going to really come from a federal level, right? The federal government can't dictate zoning. That's a local thing. It's going to have to come from local folks saying, look, we want people who have lived in this area to continue to live here, right? And we need to help make that affordable, give them options. We want to have a diverse set of people, young and old, being able to live here. So we need to have a diverse set of housing options for them. And try to work change locally. But you're also going to have to do that without, you're going to need developers, you're going to need the private sector, because local governments can't afford this.
Yeah. Jericho Hill, our economist buddy, he joins us frequently, always working face, never as a heel. Appreciate you, sir. Until we get you back on Heard Tell again, let folks know where they can follow you on your social media and the writing and your Substack.
I'm just waiting to do a Hollywood Hogan heel turn on Andrew in a few months, okay?
I did it for the money.
I'm the third man. Yeah, we'll get to that. You can find me on Twitter at economist. Now that my health is returning, I'll probably restart my Substack and talk about housing policy issues there. Of course, you'll find me. I will try to write more articles, as I always promise, for Ordinary Times. I love the site. I love the people on there. And as always, I'm on Twitter as economist as well, and always happy to talk to folks about econ, issues and housing and things like that.
Yep, you're the best, buddy. I appreciate you. We'll have you back again soon.
You're pretty good, man. No problem. Bye-bye.
Bye.